I'm Jonathan Freedland. I'm going to be chairing this session. I'm just going to say a few words about it before I introduce our rather brilliant and stellar panel. So the title before us is War on Trial, From Nuremberg to Ukraine. Can international justice ever be delivered? And it seems to me that there are at least two distinct sets of questions in there, and the three people up here are people who have wrestled with those questions in a very profound way, and through three books in particular, each one of them has done. But we'll come to that in a second. So what are those questions? I mean, war on trial, I think the first bundle of questions is whether war ever brings justice. I mean, are there times when war is the only way to bring a measure of justice? And that comes to mind partly because of the conflict that I think is going to be in the front of our minds throughout our conversation, which is the war for Ukraine now. And I think, instinctively we would all imagine that it would somehow be extremely unjust to demand that the Ukrainians lay down their arms and settle with Russia now, if that meant conceding territory that was taken from them. And those are themes that are obviously very addressed front and centre in Olesya's work, and we'll come to that in our conversation. And if that means war itself is on trial, as in whether it's ever just, and so on, what should then be our verdict? So that's the first sort of set of questions. And then the second one is whether justice can ever be done to those people who have committed crimes in the course of war, whether Nuremberg and all the legal doctrines surrounding it, which of course formed a big part of Philippe's work, whether they suggest the answer is yes, that sometimes justice can come, because in that case some war criminals were held to account, or that the answer is no, because it was so few war criminals who were brought to justice. And how significant is it perhaps that there was no equivalent of Nuremberg for the crimes committed by the Soviet Union, and those again loom very large in Danny's new book. So you can see why this panel has been meticulously well chosen for the subjects in hand. So why don't I get on and introduce them? So just in order of proximity, on my immediate left is Danny Finkelstein, who is, as you all know, a columnist in the Times newspaper, a member of the House of Lords, and crucially for our conversation, the author of a new book called Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, which turns on the twin narratives of his parents and is a remarkable story. Next is Olesya Khromeychuk, who is the author of Death of a Soldier Told by His Sister. Like Danny's book, an intensely personal book. It's much more contemporary. It's about the current war for Ukraine, which people sometimes think started in 2022, but didn't. It's been running for the best part of a decade. And as Olesya, I'm sure, will tell you, she has a very direct connection to that, but also in her other scholarly work has written very directly about Ukraine in the Second World War. So these themes all coming together. And completing our panel, Philippe Sands, international lawyer and jurist, and known to many people here as the author of the multiply award-winning East-West Street, which gets into these doctrines around justice and war, and the author most recently of The Last Colony, about the story of the Chagos Islands, a case in which he's involved very directly. So that's our panel. As I said, all these themes about the war in Ukraine now and the war of the Second World War and how it was fought in Ukraine, they are intertwined. And this is odd because this only came together in the last week or so, an instance of how these two narratives do collide. That moment in the Canadian Parliament, which some of you will be aware of, where Volodymyr Zelensky was the guest of honor and the speaker, and his host thought it would be a nice gesture to have someone in the public gallery who had fought for Ukraine in the Second World War, a 98-year-old veteran. Big standing ovation and applause, and it later turned out that 98-year-old veteran had fought with the Waffen-SS, thereby embarrassing Zelensky and just churning up all these questions and showing that past and present in this area collide often. Okay, so I've set out there the sort of set of questions that I think are in play here, and I want to leave it as open as possible because I think it will be helpful for people to hear just a little from you rather than from me about each of the books. So why don't we start with you, Danny? Just given what the book is about, how do you come at those two sets of questions that I've set out?
Sure. Well, war, what is it good for? Absolutely something, is my answer. My grandfather, Alfred Wiener, my mother's father, he comes back after the First World War, and he realises that the idea of complete equality that the Jews thought they faced in Germany, in Berlin where he lived, actually the prospect was much darker. And that possibly, unless something was done, they faced the possibility of pogroms and violent death. And he began a campaign which was really based around the facts. He writes a pamphlet called Towards Pogroms, Facts for Thoughtful People. He believed that the truth would be liberating. And throughout the 1920s and 30s, he goes and addresses meetings, and he tries to address libels. He sues Nazis. He sues Julius Streicher, puts Julius Streicher in jail.
The editor of Der Stürmer.
The editor of Der Stürmer, later one of the Nuremberg defendants. And later in his life, he contributes documents to the Nuremberg trial. He's the only person that has a picture of Joseph Mengele. He contributes to the Eichmann trial before his death. In other words, he devotes his whole life to the idea that the truth will be liberating. But I've obviously missed out a big thing, which is what happens between the time that he sues the publishers of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in Switzerland and the time when he contributes to the Nuremberg trial. And that is the period in which his wife and family, my mother and her mother, are caught in Holland, end up first in Westerbork and then in Belsen, only ever are released from Belsen and survive the war because they had a passport which was a lie, which was suggested they were Paraguayan citizens when they were not. In other words, the relationship of truth to my grandfather's story is more complicated than he thought it was and than it seems. And what happens in that middle period is we fight a war, and had we not done so, all of my grandfather's work would have been for nothing, and it wouldn't have received the vindication that it did. And it's an illustration that, unfortunately, sometimes even our ideas that if we have complete free speech and we sort out and we discuss with each other what the ideas and we work it through, we're going to be all right. Sometimes we aren't. And so learning the story of my grandfather, I can never have complete faith that he had in the power of ideas unless it's also yoked to force sometimes, which is necessary occasionally to resist oppression.
So you talk there about this narrative that's the Hitler and mum bit of the story, but just say, because it tees up where we're going to go with Olesya and Philippe, just the Stalin and dad bit of the story.
Well, my father was born in the place that is now called Lviv, but was Lvov when he was born. It was in eastern Poland. He was the son of a very rich businessman who was known as the Iron King of Lvov, and Dolu, my father's father, ends up being arrested and sent to the Gulag when the Soviets invade Poland, which they do in concert with the fascists. So the Nazis have entered from one end, the Soviets enter from the other end. They then call a false election. All this sort of will be very familiar to you in the techniques that are being used now. They call a fake election, use that to make Lvov part of Soviet Lviv. The person who organises that, by the way, is Nikita Khrushchev, who moves into the house exactly opposite my dad's house. You can see it from his bedroom window. Philippe and I went there and saw it for ourselves. So the result of that is my grandfather is accused of strengthening the might of capitalist Poland, and that makes him an antisocial element. He's sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag. And then they deported all of the families. So probably people don't necessarily know this, but hundreds of thousands of people. And the only reason that they survived the war is because Hitler invades the Soviet Union and Stalin has to strike a deal with the Poles. The reason that this touches on our theme is that at the Nuremberg trials, to which Alfred, my maternal grandfather, is contributing, all of the crimes with which the Soviets, with which the Nazis are found guilty of, the Soviets were guilty of too. When I was researching the book, the first folder I opened of my grandfather's, of material on my grandfather at home, which I'd been given by a member of the family, the first thing that came out of it was my grandfather's personal copy of the Nuremberg indictment, which he kept from his period of involvement with the trial. And when I read it, I realised that the crimes against peace, the invasion of Poland was a crime against peace. The crimes against humanity, what happened to the soldiers at Katyn was a crime against humanity, and war crimes. The shooting of the officers was also a war crime, and conspiracy to commit those crimes. They were guilty of that too, but they were not found guilty because they were victors in this war, and therefore they were on the trial side. Indeed, as Philippe knows, they tried to charge the Nazis with the Katyn murders that they'd committed themselves.
So in terms of the question before us, can international justice ever be delivered? Your story answers that by saying only to the losers, in a way.
Well, yes, Nuremberg was victor's justice, but would I say ever? No, I think it's an objective we can move towards.
All right, so Olesya, we've heard there about how Danny's family story runs through this 70, 80 years ago, but your experience and the way you come at these questions is more immediate.
Absolutely. By the way, I'm from Lviv, so my hometown. So I think we have this connection here.
Yeah, I'm the minority now on here.
There you go.
Of this four. Yeah.
Time for you to come and visit. So justice and war, I think there's an awful lot of injustice that is brought in the middle of the war, but there's also opportunities that can be found in the context of war. And I'd like to focus on three sort of types of opportunities. And the first one is to address, well, how did we get here? How was it possible that we found ourselves in the middle of this war? And if we talk about Russia's war against Ukraine now, we have to think about the facilitation of the escalation in 2022. Why was it possible? How did we fail at our own slogan from the Second World War, never again? And what does it mean to stay neutral in the middle of this kind of war that we witnessed for the first 8 years since the start of Russia's war against Ukraine, 2014? I mean, we felt very comfortable in this sort of neutral position, but in fact, neutrality facilitated strengthening of Russian aggression and escalation eventually, and also impunity for those 8 years. Russia broke international law, it annexed Crimea, occupied Crimea, it started aggression in eastern Ukraine, and it enjoyed complete impunity for the crimes that it was committing. In fact, it benefited from the crimes that it was committing. So I think this is the first opportunity, is to figure out how did we get here, how did we allow it to happen. The second opportunity is to maybe reevaluate some of our preconceived ideas such as peace. For instance, nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians, believe me, at the moment. And yet it's a highly problematic word for Ukrainians right now. When people call for peace, Ukrainians get very nervous because it often means concessions. It means ceasefire that will prolong the war, essentially. Because for Ukrainians, there will be no peace without, and here's the key word, justice. Right? So this is another, I think, opportunity. And the other opportunity is for us to have a look at the outdated structures that we took for granted, perhaps, a security structure that failed us. Again, coming back to this never again, we are witnessing a horrendous, I would say, genocidal war in the middle of Europe at the moment, and the structures of justice, of international justice. Ukrainian human rights lawyers are speaking at international platforms, including Nobel Peace winner Alexandra Matvichuk, and asking for weapons. I mean, that should make us think that this is what it's come to. A good friend of mine, Victoria Milina, I know you knew her as well, Philippe, was a writer, a children's writer, a poet. She retrained to be, to record, to document war crimes, and traveled around liberated territories to record war crimes committed by the Russian troops there. And she was killed in one of those war crimes in Khromeychuk in June, just now, at the start of the summer. So, you know, the fact that writers retrain to collect evidence of war crimes should really make us think that justice really matters for Ukrainians. And this is, I suppose, partly what my book is about, because I talk about my own example of my brother dying in 2017 at the front in Popasna. Now everybody knows about the city of Popasna because it's razed to the ground. Is destroyed by the Russians. At the time, nobody knew about Popasna, but nobody really knew about the war that Russia was waging in Ukraine. We perceived the Russians the way they wanted to be perceived, as some kind of peace brokers, at some kind of negotiations, such as an absolutely impossible agreements like the Minsk agreements. So at the time when he was killed at the front in action, there was no sense of justice at all, and no opportunity to even begin to think, to conceptualize that type of justice. And I'd like to give you one other example of what the vacuum of justice leaves for people. So a friend of mine, Alesia Kichuk, a filmmaker, extremely talented filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, she was captured by the Russians in 2014 as she was making film in her film in Eastern Ukraine, held in captivity, subjected to horrendous experiences, eventually released. And she promised herself that if there's an escalation, she will not continue filming. She will take up arms. And that's what she did. She joined the army and fought for 6 months, participated in the liberation of Kharkiv region, because she did not rely on any future justice. She felt that she had to ensure that she's in a position to defend herself, to defend her life and that of her compatriots. And I think it's worth thinking about what it means if justice isn't served.
I want to ask you about that in a second, but I'm just struck by you were talking about these people who'd taken up these, intellectual work, academic work, putting that aside and taking up arms.
Yeah.
You've mentioned about the loss of your brother, but you've been in the United Kingdom, I think, 20 years. Has it crossed your mind since 2022 to put that aside and go and actually get involved in the fight yourself?
I think my brother was the first one to ask me if I was going to do it. No, not necessarily, but a lot of it's partly the privilege of living in the West, which we all enjoy, that we don't feel the urgency to do it just yet. My friends don't have that choice in Ukraine. A lot of my colleagues from the same field as I am, academics, writers, but also my cousins who are village boys, they've been called up. Others have volunteered to join the armed forces. I am lucky not to have had to make that choice. That's why it's so important for me to amplify the voices of those people who are fighting on our behalf. When I say on our behalf, I don't just mean Ukrainians. I mean on our behalf here.
Philippe, you can tell us how you come at these questions that we've just set out, but I just want you particularly perhaps to pick up the last thought that Olesya was saying, this tension between justice and peace, because people can look at conflict in all kinds of contexts around the world. Pops into my head Northern Ireland, where people, in order to get a peace deal, have to compromise on justice, so that convicted killers were let out of prisons. You think of the Chile case, in order to get an agreement there, it meant you had to let Pinochet and the regime go without facing justice. When you hear Olesya make that sort of that demand that Ukrainians need for justice, you as a lawyer in the field of international justice, do you think, well, if you're going to get peace, you're probably going to have to sacrifice justice?
Well, firstly, it's very good to be here with Danny and Olesya. And Olesya, for those of you who don't know, has been doing just a most incredible job in the UK on helping us understand the true extent of what is going on. So I just want to say thank you for everything that you're doing. These are really big and complex questions, and it's not a straight sort of balance: war, peace, justice, and politics plays a really big role in all of these issues. Wrapping that into your two questions, yes, there are times where war is the only way. When Russia invades Ukraine in a manifestly illegal act of aggression, there is no alternative but to respond to it with force and to assist Ukraine. And I am an unreconstructed supporter of giving Ukraine everything that it needs, and frankly going even further if necessary. Bottom line for me is that in the heart of Europe in 2022, 2023, Vladimir Putin cannot prevail in this conflict. And prevailing in this conflict includes holding on to any part of the territory of Ukraine. So we have no alternative. There is no alternative to military force in this particular context. Now, the difficulty when it comes to the justice issue is that the justice system that we have internationally is new, it's imperfect, and it's a long game. We have 4 international crimes since Nuremberg, and many of them are connected, as we all know, to this extraordinary Ukrainian city of Lviv, as I described in East West Street. The origins of 2 of those crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, can be traced to 2 individuals who came from the city of Lviv. War crimes from the 19th century, crimes against humanity, which refers to the systematic destruction of individuals, the crime of genocide, which refers to the destruction of groups, and we can come back to this as to whether or not it's a genocidal war. And fourth, the crime of aggression, which at Nuremberg was called crimes against peace. The first 3, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, are all within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which is moving very actively to investigate and to prosecute, and as you know, has indicted Vladimir Putin and his child commissioner for the deportation of children. But the major international crime in this whole story, the crime of crimes, is the decision taken by a small number of people, led by Vladimir Putin, Mr. Shoigu, Mr. Lavrov, to decide to launch the war. And that is the crime of aggression. And the International Criminal Court doesn't have jurisdiction over that crime for a range of technical, legal, and political reasons. I was approached by the Financial Times within a day of the war, special operation, if you want to call it that, beginning in February 2022. You know about Ukraine, you've written about Lviv. 700 words, please, on Ukraine and international law, Ukraine and justice. And I thought about it for a day, and then I wrote 700 words on really what we need to do is do what has not been done since 1945, deal with this crime of aggression. And since the International Criminal Court can't deal with it, what needs to happen is we need to create a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression. And what was in my mind was the horror of the idea that in 5 years' time, you have half a dozen low-grade paramilitaries or Russian troops hauled up in The Hague, but the top table is off the hook completely. You've got to put the spotlight on the top table, the small group of people who engaged in this war. I proposed it, the idea is running, and then in the course of that, something very strange happened. The article came out in the FT, I think, on the 26th of February. You write an article in a newspaper, you know that thing, there's about sort of 8 people and 2 dogs write to you and say fabulous or terrible or whatever, and then you move on to the next thing. This was a deluge. I mean, former prime ministers wrote, former presidents wrote, people from across the world, hundreds of emails, and one thing led to another. And the foreign minister of Ukraine was one of the people who reached out to me, Dmytro Kuleba, and moved the idea with President Zelensky, and that process is now in negotiation. But another person who reached out to me, I didn't know him, was the former British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. Out of the blue, I get a communication saying, I read the piece, this is really important, this is really interesting, I'd like to help. And I welcomed that. But let us be frank, there is a big elephant in the room when it comes to Britain and the United States calling for justice in Ukraine. And that elephant in the room is Iraq. Iraq was a manifestly illegal war, just as Ukraine is a manifestly illegal war. And one of the reasons the global South has not engaged with the West and the North in siding openly and actively with Ukraine is the hypocrisy and double standards. So when it comes to the crime of aggression, speaking very frankly, the 2 top guys on Iraq are Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair. And what's happened to them? Nothing. Bit of loss of, public support. Mr. Blair can't go walking around in the streets of London. But actually, nothing. Nothing. Hundreds of thousands of people died in Iraq following that war. What happened? Absolutely nothing. And this has continuing consequences. you might ask yourself, what on earth is the connection between my new book and all of these stories? In short, Britain for 50 years illegally occupied the Chagos Archipelago, the British Indian Ocean territory. I was part of a team that obtained a decision of the International Court of Justice in February 2019, ruling Britain's occupation unlawful and ordering the United Kingdom to leave the British Indian Ocean Territory. Diego Garcia, major US military base. The British government said no, 2 thumbs up, 2 fingers up to the International Court of Justice. And then magically, I'd love to be able to say that it was the publication of The Last Colony in September 2022 that caused Liz Truss, let's give her credit, for changing position. But I don't think it was the publication of Philippe Sands' book. It was this. And I've heard it directly from African presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers. You know what? The British came to us and said to us, help us dislodge Russia from its illegal occupation of Ukraine. The South African ambassador put it to me, you know what? We listened to that and we said to them, really, you're in illegal occupation of a part of Africa. You ignore a decision of the International Court of Justice and you suddenly expect us to drop everything and support you in this struggle. No way, bugger off. And that is why right now, in relation to the quest for justice, it's incredibly lopsided. At the International Court of Justice this week, hearings concluded in a case brought by Ukraine against Russia. 35 countries or so intervened in those proceedings in support of Ukraine, all Western, all Northern, not a single country from the global South. It's a terrible thing. And I think we've got in this issue of justice double standard.
Can I ask you a question? Just follow, because and this is a genuine question as opposed to making a point with a question mark at the end of it. When you talk about Iraq, that can also stand for a whole range of places in the world where we might see, and your book raises, East West Street raises this, and I've raised it with you before, I think, personally, where you see oppressive regimes which have sovereignty. Saddam Hussein's was an example of that. I don't want to get too bogged down in the specifics of Iraq, but he was an example of it. Certainly, the thing that I found difficult was to ignore the people that he was feeding into mincemeat machines because you don't want to support an aggressive war. At what point in your scheme does it become necessary for, I suppose, countries to act as world policemen? Leave the Chagos Islands out, because as you know, I agree with you about that, and I think that that point is well made. But I think it does apply to Iraq to some degree, and it also applies in lots of places in the world. Iran is another example. Are we not failing the test Alesia set us if we just say, well, it doesn't matter if these... The one thing we mustn't do is invade another country, even if it's being run by a horrendous dictator who's killing their own people, has launched aggressive wars against next-door neighbours, is feeding his opponents into mincemeat machines.
These are really important points, but here, we can take a 30-second lesson on international law. There are 2 circumstances under current international law, warts and all, in which you can use force. 1, in self-defense. You can always use force. You are attacked or you're threatened with an attack, you can use military force. And 2, authorization by the Security Council. Right, that's extremely problematic, created in 1945, 5 permanent members. One of the 5's always going to veto what happens. So it's basically a dead letter. There was a 3rd incipient rule emerging in the 1990s. Jonathan's written about it, he knows about it. The responsibility to protect. It's called humanitarian intervention. You can use force to protect a population against, if you like, its own leadership and its own government. But that's not an established rule of international law. So I'm actually strongly in favour of moving towards that kind of rule, and I would support that kind of rule. Yeah. But the reality is, where do you draw the line? Okay, Iraq was a pretty nasty government. But actually, right now, I would say some of the governments who are our best friends in the world, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and others, are pretty nasty governments. So the problem is, where do you draw the line?
Alesia, I want to hear your reaction to that, and also to the putting together the 2 points that Philippe made earlier, which is on the one hand he said we've got to go even further, Putin must not prevail, and yet on the other hand, you know, the invocation of Nuremberg, it makes you, I've often wondered, is the only way to ensure that Putin and Putinism does not prevail a 1945-style total defeat of Putin's Russia? Is that the only way this threat is going to be dealt with? But you had your own response to what Philippe and Danny were arguing.
I wanted to pick up on what you were saying about the lack of support in the so-called global south. I think it's a problematic term, and we should probably think of addressing that issue differently without using that term, but just for the sake of the conversation now, I'll continue using it in inverted commas. It's partly because Russia has put an awful lot of effort into persuading the countries of the so-called global south that it's something that it is not. I mean, it's put a lot of effort into the global north as well, let's face it, through money, through soft power, through all sorts of political influence, through creating Londongrad in London, here, just around the corner. But that goes back to the question. So more recently, it's through political influence, through mercenary groups such as Wagner being extremely active and disruptive on the African continent, and through various manipulations of different kind. But it's also about the creation, so going back to the idea of the past colliding with the present, creation of a certain image of itself, again through impunity. I mean, so it takes so much effort to explain to people at the moment that Russia has never ceased to be an empire. It's never ceased to behave like an empire, that this war is a neo-colonial war. And partly it is because it's managed to create some kind of illusion of itself as a social, as the Soviet Union has been some kind of socialist, proper socialist state, and also Russia as as a successor of that socialist state, when in fact it's a authoritarian kleptocracy, right? And I think the fact that there's never been any reckoning for the Holodomor, the famine against Ukraine, which is recognized as genocide in many countries, including the UK, of 1930s. There's been no reckoning for the crimes committed by the Red Army, the Soviet Red Army, during the Second World War, which were horrendous. And if you look at the type of crimes that were being committed during the Second World War, mass rapes, looting, they are so similar to the kind of crimes that Russian army is committing in Ukraine at the moment and has committed in Chechnya. Before that in other parts of the world. There's been no reckoning at all on that state level, but also on the level of society. So going back to your idea about Putin and total defeat, it's not Putin's war, it's Russia's war. I think we need to think about this, finally understand that we've created some sort of idea of Russia in our heads that simply does not exist. And the sooner we understand what sort of Russia we're dealing with, the sooner we will be able to figure out how to deal with it in the future. And that society does share complicity, and that trying Putin will be wonderful, of course, and I really hope so. And I was really saddened to see how excited the public got when Prigozhin staged his mini coup, which did not materialize in the end, because he was somehow perceived as a potential hero who's taken on Putin. This is one of the worst war criminals that we've seen in this war and in previous wars. But we have this desire to kind of look a great man and, who's going to win. It's not a video game. It's not a film. We're talking about thousands of ruined lives and a country that has been totally wrecked, and it's going to take a long time to restore it.
But that point, and especially your point that it's a delusion to think it's just Putin, it's Russia, that only actually makes the question heavier, which is it going to require a 1945-style defeat of Russia itself, for Russia to suffer the kind of humiliation that Germany suffered in 45? Is that what has to happen to end in the kind of Nuremberg type of reckoning and justice?
I certainly feel as though if it had done in 1945, the history would have been different. So it's difficult to answer that question because of all that would be required to make it happen again. But it's certainly my conclusion that Putin's version of the history of Ukraine was only possible to advance if you ignore all the things that had gone before it. And it was the thing that happened in the Canadian Parliament was so fascinating because it illustrated the almost incredible illiteracy sophisticated people have about this incredibly important place that he didn't know. The moment I suppose any of the three of us heard that sentence, we would immediately, that somebody had fought for the independence of Ukraine in a Second World War against Russian aggression, you would immediately have thought to yourself, well, that's an interesting way of putting it, right? So you would have known what it meant. So I certainly am of the view that moving on smoothly in 1945, letting in the case of my parents, letting the Russians move into Herbatov or Helsinki Street, as you would know it, and take over the houses there and use them as summer houses for Communist Party officials. That is responsible, at least partly, for the way that Putin's able to frame the war.
I just want to. It's so important what Olesya said about the no reckoning point. Okay, but let's be frank. We all live in societies that have no reckoning, within the family, within the community, within the towns, within a country. The idea of no reckoning is something everyone in this room understands personally and in a broader sense. Why was Mr. Lavrov welcomed with open arms in South Africa? When I saw the images of that, I was just horrified. And I reached out to various South African friends, black and white, and they all said the same thing. History matters. The government in South Africa has not forgotten that while the West, led by the United Kingdom, opposed sanctions, supported apartheid, and did nothing to change the politics in South Africa, the Soviet Union was helping the ANC. And the folks who ran the ANC then are in government today. And they have not forgotten what the Soviet Union, Moscow, did in relation to that situation. And if you come forward with matters of reckoning, our own society, Britain, has had no reckoning with its past. At school, and then unbelievably 30 years later, my children got pages and pages about the greatness of the United Kingdom in ending trade in slavery. But I went back to my school books and I saw my kids' school books, and there's nothing about the engagement in trade in slavery and no ability to have a reckoning of not just the good things that a country has done around the world, but also the not so good things. So I think this idea of no reckoning is central, because point to me to a society that has had a full reckoning. There are very few. Germany is probably the only one that I know in relation to what has happened between 1933 and 1945. And look at what that is doing now. They've had a full reckoning, and we're now at the beginning of a backlash in relation to, frankly, we've had enough of these museums, these memorials, these compensatory payments. It's 80 years later, enough is enough. We're sick of being scapegoated for what our grandparents did. So the reckoning issue, the interplay between history, politics and law, I think as you're saying, is at the heart of these issues.
I just want to pick up on the importance of history. Obviously, being a historian is difficult not to, but also the fact that the Canadian incident has been brought up more than once now. I wrote my PhD on the Waffen-SS Galicia division, and my first book is precisely on that, and on the role of the UK government in allowing the Galicia veterans to actually move to the UK first and then to Canada. A fascinating bit of British history here, I must say, but I'm not going to give you a lecture and a short brief summary of my PhD. What that situation showed to me was several things. First, it was definitely a mistake, and it was a terrible mistake, and extremely unfortunate that it happened also in the presence of President Zelensky. But it also, the story of the Waffen-SS Galicia division is poorly studied. It's only been studied by a few scholars, and so it's extremely polarized and instrumentalized by people who use that story to their advantage for whatever reasons that may be. And at the moment it's acting as a distraction from the larger question, the larger question of Russia's war against Ukraine. And the Russians are loving it. And it's all over. If you Google it, it comes up on all of the Russian websites, and they say, we told you so. You see, this proves some kind of strange, bizarre myths about denazification of Ukraine and so on. But for me, one lesson that I could really draw, and this is relevant to our discussion today, from that situation is that what happened to the Waffen-SS Galicia division members at the end of the war was there was no proper inquiry into what they did, not as a unit. There were some inquiries about them, their activity during the war as a unit, but as individual members of that unit. There was an inquiry in 1940, well, immediately after the war, for sort of 45, 46, 47, by the British, to whom they surrendered, and it was so superficial. And one thing that, a couple of sort of examples that I remember from the documents, I remember them referring to Mr. Brown, who interviewed the men, because he was the only one with some Russian. These men were from the Second Polish Republic. They were from Eastern Galicia. They were brought up in Ukrainian and Polish. And they found Mr. Brown, who spoke a little bit of Russian, to interview them. They also said we couldn't figure out whether they were from Poland or the USSR, what became USSR, or what, because we didn't have maps that were large enough to figure out where the villages were from. So it was a combination of lack of desire, lack of skill, and lack of time to do that investigation properly. And then the next investigation that happened in Canada in the 80s relied on the consequences of, on the conclusions of the first post-war investigation. So this really shows you, unless you investigate war crimes or potential war crimes properly, these kind of issues will continue popping up in the future. They will continue to be instrumentalized, and we'll continue, witnessing them.
I want to bring in people. Did you have something very short to say on this? Okay, let's use the time we have to take some questions. I can see lots of hands are going up. If we, I don't know who's got the microphones, but if we get the microphone to the two people here, we'll go one after the other. And then if we can have is there somebody here? Bring a microphone to the gentleman here. We'll take three. Yeah, it's over here. So you go first, yeah, and then just pass it.
Yes. Philippe mentioned the word reckoning. Reckoning supposes a bill, something to be paid. Other processes such as truth and reconciliation have been tried in, obviously, South Africa and in Northern Ireland, and in Belfast we still have peace lines in various areas. Where should we be going with this? A reckoning or a reconciliation? And when one should add truth should be added to both of those.
Thank you, and let's hear your question.
Yeah, I mean, just confirming the complexities you were talking about between Russia and Ukraine. Actually, in 2014, I was in Moscow, and I went out to dinner with my colleagues from my Moscow office, and I couldn't realize who's Ukrainian, who's Russian. And I realized, well, at the dinner that there were some Ukrainian, some Russian, but the Russians had either Ukrainian grandmother or the Ukrainians had a Russian wife. There's a lot of intermixing, of course, and those complexities existed when the Crimea situation happened. But fast forward to today, those complexities, of course, exist, and we recognize. But, increasingly, Putin, yeah, sorry, the point is that those complexities exist, but even today, I feel that this is becoming a war of attrition. And is there a light at the end of the tunnel, you guys who know about this more, that could come to an end?
Thank you. And I think you've got the microphone already.
Yeah, I have. So you can't take it away from me.
Good.
Hi. My name's Charlotte Eager. I was the Balkans correspondent of The Observer and also 30 years ago the Daily Mail Ukraine stringer in 1992. So I wanted to talk really about war crimes because Bosnia was, asked rather about Bosnia. We did have a war crimes commission afterwards, and it has, I think, frankly, been largely pretty effective at taking down both the leaders and foot soldiers as well, which was obviously very satisfying for me personally and other people. But does it mean if you have a situation like that where you are going to get the top guys and they are going to end up in The Hague and they know that there's absolutely no incentive for them to ever surrender and give up? Or are they not going to surrender anyway because war is a tiger they're riding and they can't imagine themselves ever giving up anyway?
Thank you. Who wants to pick? I think, Danny, you go first.
The first thing on this question, well, I suppose it unites all three questions. In the end, you have to win a victory before any of these processes. you can choose how you then want to end, whether you use truth and reconciliation in some cases, or whether you decide, as we did with the Nazis, to prosecute some people. And one of the things that was really interesting to me in researching my book is how many of the people. My mother is in Westerbork concentration camp. There's a man called Khromeychuk who runs the camp. He sees all these trains that leave for Auschwitz and Sobibor, and for years after the end of the war, he isn't arrested. Then he's given a very small sentence and lives the rest of his life in Düsseldorf. And so, even in this case, a lot of these people don't pay the full price, the full bill that was mentioned for these crimes. But before you can reach any of these points, you have to be clear what you're trying to do and win victory. So, in the case of Northern Ireland, before there could be a peace, effectively the intelligence services infiltrated the IRA to the point where they could no longer operate and they had to give up. That's really what happened there. And afterwards we got a process of reconciliation based on victory, and I think that is the only way you'll ever bring real lasting peace, I'm afraid.
Alesia, I mentioned earlier this tension between justice and peace, and I thought that last question brought it out, which is even the prospect of justice and prosecutions could make peace a more distant prospect because, said the question, you could have commanders and others who think, whatever happens, we've got to keep fighting because we can't risk losing because that way we end up in The Hague.
I don't know. I mean, we've seen the change in morale a lot in the Russian army. These are, we obviously saw the mutiny in one of the most effective parts of the Russian army, the Wagner Group. So that shows us that the morale is pretty low. I wouldn't underestimate the Russian army. There's plenty of people with low morale who are being used as cannon fodder, as they were used in the Second World War in the Red Army as well. And that's good enough to continue the war for a long time. But I think that there is also a very kind of weak desire now. All of those myths that the Russians were being fed with are not working anymore, that they're coming to liberate Ukrainians. I mean, they arrive in Ukraine and they see the Ukrainians live much better than they do in Russia, and they realize it as the liberators who need liberation. So that doesn't work. I'm not sure. Of course, some of the command will try to cover their backs, but that's a separate issue. I wanted to talk about reconciliation. It's one of those kind of comfortable words that we like to use, like neutrality. There will be no reconciliation, I think, there's no question of reconciliation between Ukrainians and Russians until there's justice. But also, I can't imagine it happening in my generation or even younger. I think it's going to take several generations. But we do need to talk about reconciliation in the context of reintegration of occupied territories, especially those territories that have been occupied for 9 years now. So there is something that Ukrainians are thinking very hard about, is how to reintegrate those territories, how to create that dialogue between people who were left in occupation, who found themselves in occupation for such a long time, and the rest of Ukraine. I also wanted to briefly mention, address the comment that you were saying. I'm not entirely sure what your question was, but it's often
the very last part of the question,
intermixing.
which was this war of attrition, and is there light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, do you see this you said to me just before we started, this is going on and on. When you were at this festival a year ago, people were thinking this was maybe a short-term thing, and here we still are. Are we going to be here next year and the year after and the year after?
Yeah. For us to achieve, I think, that light at the end of the tunnel, I do also want to address the beginning of the question as well. And that's something to remember, that whatever happened in terms of intermixing, the complex history that Ukraine and Russia has, in 1991, Ukrainians made a very clear choice. 90% of them voted in the referendum for independence. And it's a sovereign state. And even if it dropped from the sky in 1991, nobody had the right to violate its borders in 2014 and 2022. So let's leave the ethnic, the linguistic, and so on arguments, because they really do not stand ground anymore. We need to think about this slightly differently. And we need to accept Ukraine as an agent and stop assuming that it's somehow an object in some kind of proxy war. It's an agent that is making choices, and it's Ukrainians who are being killed and are dying defending their country. So to see the end of the tunnel, in order to see the end of the tunnel, we need to be invested in Ukrainian victory as much as Ukrainians are, because the delays in deliveries of weapons, the constant hesitation and U-turns have already prolonged the war. So our determination is going to provide the end of the tunnel, the light at the end of the tunnel.
I want to bring Philippe in, but I do want to get a microphone to our questioner here. In fact, why don't we, if you go to stop halfway down, because there's a lady's got a hand up, keep your hand up. There we are. And then when you've done your question, we'll bring it to you. But Philippe, do you want to come in?
Just very briefly,
yeah.
just because we do want more questions. On the reckoning issue, just to be clear what my position is on that, I wouldn't put all your store in courts and tribunals. They are a tiny part of the process of addressing this over the longer term. And the bigger issue is how to get an authoritative accounting, including in narrative terms, whether it's truth and reconciliation, whether it's reporting, whether it's an independent report, whether it's literature, whether it's the school history books, of what did and did not happen. There are many different ways of doing that. And one of the reasons, linking the first question with the third, that I'm wary about putting all our store in the International Criminal Court or Special Crimes of Aggression Tribunal is precisely my own experience in the former Yugoslavia. The rulings of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which got people at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom, more or less evenly across the three states, not only has not brought calm and reconciliation, but may even have exacerbated the problem. One example. The ICTY, the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, characterized what happened at Srebrenica as a genocide. But it was only willing to characterize what happened at Vukovar as a crime against humanity. And Croatia, to this day, nearly 20 years later, is deeply angry that one part of the conflict, where the same things basically happened, gets a genocide which is seen as the top tier, which I don't think it is, whereas we only got a crime against humanity. And that rulings of the ICTY will cause further conflict in years ahead. So it's a very complex equation.
Yeah, you can open up more resentments just by the process.
Yeah.
Let's take these two questions. We may run out of time, but let's go with your first and then yours. Yeah.
Thank you. Picking up on the theme that this is a frozen war, and the longer that the war lasts, more entrenched, the greater the political economy war becomes functional. I'm just wondering, what is the least worst outcome? So in terms of expanding the conversation about justice, what would a just peace actually look like for society and its populations?
Specifically in Ukraine, we're talking about.
Specifically
yes.
in Ukraine.
What does a just peace look like?
What does a just peace look like?
Thank you. And then your one?
Yeah. Firstly, apologies, Jonathan. I also have a Lviv connection. I was on a live stream with the defence conference in Lviv earlier.
Feeling very outnumbered. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I have a question for Olesya. Do you think that Ukraine would be willing to make any concessions in exchange for NATO membership and the security guarantee that would entail?
Very good. Okay, those will be our last. So we have 5 minutes left. So why don't you, Olesya, that was directly to you. What would there be concessions that Ukraine might be willing to make in return for NATO membership?
No. The short answer is no, because, like I said before, I mean, giving up territory, it's not territory that we give up. When we talk about giving up territory, we usually, when people talk about it, I usually know that they've never been to Ukraine, they don't know Ukraine, because it's easy to talk about territory, about the place that is... No, I know, I understand, yeah. But these, so when Ukrainians are being encouraged to consider concessions and give up territory, it's usually, coming from the sort of groups that don't necessarily understand the war and how horrendous the occupation has already been so far. And it means surrendering those people in occupied territories to continue treatment of that kind, where they are being tortured, where they are being killed, and where there are mass graves and so on. So I think the two questions are linked, and I might try and answer both of them. So justice, how does justice look for Ukrainians? I mean, the Ukrainian state has developed a comprehensive document of what they propose, but the main key points from that document is restoration of territorial integrity. So that's to answer your questions, and making sure that the Russian troops leave all Ukrainian territory and deoccupation of all of it, of course. Punishment for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and so on, and crime of aggression, of course, too, but also reparations. Reparations for the damage caused to the infrastructure, but also to the environment, something we always forget. I mean, this new term, and I wonder what you think about it, ecocide is being used quite a lot, but let's remember that the third of Ukrainian territory is in need of demining at the moment. And the veterans we see that have lost limbs is the outcome of the huge territory that is demined, that needs to be demined, that has been mined already, and it contaminates Ukrainian land. It affects Ukrainian trade. It affects Ukrainian agriculture, and therefore our reliance on Ukrainian grain and so on. So, so reparations too, reparations and restoration in the future. So these are, I suppose, three key elements of future just peace. Thank you.
Danny, I've said this to you before, but I think your book bristles with a kind of anger that there was a measure of justice for the victims that are on your mother's side of the story, yes, but none for the sort of Stalin father narrative in your story. Applying that lens now, what would a just peace not have looked like then, but look like now in this case?
And a major reason why that is that my parents' cases are dealt differently is because the Russians ended up on the winning side. And the only way, I do really think the only way of reaching reconciliation is victory, and that you will not get it. And we've connected, I think all three of us really agree with this, that you have to have justice before you can have reconciliation. And so I don't think there's an alternative but to help Ukraine prosecute the war until it's victorious, and until the Russians understand that that this conduct doesn't have a reward, because the truth is their discovery is that it does have a reward, and much of the time they engage in it for that reason.
And closing minute to you, Philippe Sands, what would a just peace look like? Because you're the person who day to day is trying to wrestle with this professionally as an international lawyer.
I think that I think none of us in this room can really understand the scale of the crimes that are being committed. This is literally unbelievable. It's all been done before by the Russians in Chechnya and in Syria, and the West did nothing to try to stop it. You've got targeting of totally civilian infrastructure that has nothing to do with the conflict, hundreds or thousands of kilometers away from the front line. There has to be an accounting for that. Any final situation that deals with this war must find a way to address the horrors that have happened, or there cannot be a lasting peace. Now, how you do that is going to be very difficult. I know for a fact that in the discussions that have taken place now some time ago in relation to Ukraine and Russia to sort this out, the Russians have made it objective number one as a precondition for even talking about a negotiated settlement. We take all this criminality stuff off the agenda. All of that's got to go. And so you get a sense of their anxiety about this issue and where it might lead. Second aspect, to close, I'm in 100% agreement with you, Alesia. You know that. We're in absolute solidarity. What do I think is going to happen? I think what is going to happen is if Ukraine makes progress on the ground in relation to Donbass and other parts of eastern Ukraine, at the point they reach Crimea, the West, the United States, will say, enough. It's the only way I think they will say, we give Russia a face-saving way out. And the issue then becomes, what is the status of Crimea? And ultimately, it is for Ukraine to decide what is acceptable. Your point is 100% right. This is a manifest violation of the sovereignty of an established state under international law. It is for Ukraine to decide what is acceptable. The issue for the Ukrainian leadership is, under pressure of absence of money, absence of arms, and absence of other things, will they make concessions in relation to any parts of their territory? I think that's the thing to look out for.
All right, we are out of time. I'm sure you agree with me that it's been a really sobering but also really stimulating and illuminating conversation. All three of the Lviv-related authors, plus me, are going to be available to sign books straight afterwards if you're interested, but I'm sure you're going to want to join me in thanking Philippe Sands, Olesya Khromeychuk and Danny Finkelstein. Thank you all very much.